June 1941, Eastern Front. The sun was merciless that morning, a sheet of white fire hanging over the endless wheat fields of Poland. Engines coughed and rumbled as hundreds of German tanks rolled east toward the border. Dust clung to the sides of the Panzer III and Panzer IV, coating the black crosses in a soft, yellow haze. The air smelled of hot oil, iron, and confidence. In his field journal, General Erhard Rouse wrote, "The Russians are primitive. Their machines are obsolete. Our panzers will slice through them like a blade through parchment." Around him, the officers laughed. The campaign had begun only a week ago, and already entire Soviet divisions had vanished under the precision of blitzkrieg. Minsk had fallen in 6 days. The soldiers believed the same would happen to Moscow. Inside one tank, Sergeant Franz Müller leaned back against the turret wall, eating a piece of bread gone hard from the heat. "You'll see," he said, smiling at his gunner. "They'll throw those ridiculous tin cans at us again, those T-26s. One shot and they're done. Poor devils." The gunner laughed, a dry sound swallowed by the engine's roar. "They say Stalin sent farmers to drive tractors into battle. Let's hope he brings a few more. I'm getting bored." The laughter drifted out into the fields, mixing with the rhythmic clatter of treads. Somewhere behind them, a column of infantry followed in trucks, and farther still came the supply lines, gasoline, ammunition, the arteries of a machine that believed it could not be stopped. By noon, the horizon shimmered like glass. The road east was littered with burned-out Soviet vehicles, twisted turrets, broken tracks, the husks of BT series tanks, light armor that had once been fast but now lay scattered like bones. Crows circled above them, black dots against a white sky. Lieutenant Karl Heinemann stopped his panzer beside a wreck. The Russian machine had been blown apart cleanly, the turret flung 20 meters away. He kicked a piece of metal with his boot and laughed. "This is what we're fighting. These toys." The radio man was sketching in a notebook, a habit born of boredom. "They say the Russians have heavy tanks somewhere farther east," he murmured. "Something we haven't seen yet." Heinemann smirked. "Rumors. If they had real tanks, we'd have seen them by now." But later that evening, as the convoy refueled outside a captured village, an odd sound reached them, low, distant, like thunder pressed into the ground. It was different from the rumble of their own engines, heavier, slower, deeper. The men looked up from their mess kits. "Storm?" someone asked. The horizon to the east pulsed with faint flashes, not lightning but something closer, mechanical, deliberate. Heinemann shrugged it off. "Probably artillery. The Russians still think they can shell the air." The men laughed again, forcing the unease back into silence. That night, the tanks camped beside a burned barn. The smell of pine mixed with diesel as mechanics worked under small lamps. Across the line, a company of Soviet prisoners sat in the dirt, heads down, guarded by machine guns. One of them, a boy no older than 20, looked up at the black sky and muttered something that the Germans didn't understand. But the interpreter caught it, "The night hides them." In the early hours, the first reports arrived from the forward scouts. Radio chatter filled the dark. Words cut through static, unidentified armor, large silhouettes, not the usual models. Then, silence. Muller's crew was woken before dawn. Engines flared, exhaust choking the morning fog. The company rolled forward through the fields, dew hissing on hot metal. Visibility was low, smoke from burning villages still hung over the landscape. "Keep your eyes sharp," Heinemann ordered through the headset. "They say Ivan's trying new tricks." But what they saw wasn't a trick. It was a shadow moving through the mist, larger than anything they had faced. The outline was unfamiliar, sloped armor, a wide turret, and the heavy growl of an engine that didn't sputter like the others. The gunner's voice trembled. "That's not a T-26. The first shot from the German 37mm cannon rang out, echoing across the field. It struck the stranger squarely, and bounced off. The next shot, the same. Sparks. No damage. Reload. Heinemann shouted. The enemy tank turned its gun slowly, almost lazily, and answered with a single round. The explosion lifted the panzer beside them off the ground, hurling it into the ditch like a toy. Muller's hands shook as he reloaded. What in God's name is that? No one answered. Through the smoke, the shape advanced, steady, unstoppable, indifferent. The German shells pinged harmlessly against its armor. And then, with another thunderous shot, it silenced the field. Later, in the few diaries that survived, the German soldiers wrote about that morning not as a battle, but as an awakening. The machine they had mocked, the Soviet war industry they had dismissed, had just rewritten the laws of combat. Back at headquarters, Rouse received a radio message, enemy deploying new type of tank. Extremely fast. Armor impenetrable by standard rounds. He frowned, reread the line, and underlined one word, new. That night, he added a single note to his journal. We may have underestimated them. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the fading day, the same heavy engine growled again, waiting for dawn. They were taught that Soviet machines were laughable, the narrator would later say. But history was already preparing their lesson. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. July 1941, road to Smolensk. The heat was suffocating, pressing down like a hand. Dust hung in the air, thick as fog, and the smell of scorched rubber clung to everything. German columns snaked east along narrow country roads, confident, unstoppable, or so it seemed. Reports said the Soviets were in full retreat. The front was collapsing. Victory felt inevitable. Lieutenant Otto Reinhardt, commanding a platoon of Panzer III, sat half out of his turret, goggles streaked with grime. The horizon shimmered with heat, and far ahead, the silhouette of a small village flickered through the haze. His radioman handed him a decoded message, enemy forces scattered. Expect light resistance near Mtsensk. Reinhardt smirked. Good. Maybe we'll reach Smolensk before the rations turn to stone. They advanced cautiously, though not from fear, from habit. Every kilometer, the same sight, abandoned Soviet positions, burned trucks, broken guns. A destroyed BT-7 still smoked by the roadside. The men joked that the Russians didn't even have the fuel to run away properly. By midday, the leading panzer crested a ridge overlooking a wheat field. Reinhardt raised his binoculars. At first, he saw only the wavering heat. Then, a glint, faint, metallic, and movement. A dark shape rolled out from behind a line of birches. Enemy armor, the gunner said. Reinhardt focused. The shape was broader than any Soviet tank he'd seen, low, sloped, almost predatory. He frowned. Range 800 meters. Fire. The cannon barked. Smoke filled the turret. Through the haze, he saw the shell strike the enemy's hull, and ricochet away. Not even a dent. Reload. Another round. Another spark. Still nothing. The enemy's turret turned. Slowly. Deliberately. Reinhardt felt it before he saw it, a deep, resonant boom. The tank next to his erupted in flame, turret lid flying skyward. The shockwave rattled his teeth. Back. Reverse. Now, he shouted. The driver gunned the engine, treads biting into dirt. The panzer lurched backward, barely missing another shell that tore through a hedgerow. Radios erupted with panic, it's not a KV. It's smaller. Faster. We can't, static swallowed the rest. Smoke and fire consumed the ridge. Reinhardt's formation disintegrated, tanks scattering in all directions. The unseen enemy kept advancing, unfazed. Through the dust, Reinhardt caught a clear glimpse, a red star painted across a sharply angled hull. T-34, the radioman whispered, as if naming a ghost. Reinhardt had no idea what those letters meant, but he felt the word like a wound. The thing moved with impossible speed, cutting across the field, its gun shifting toward him. He ducked inside the turret just as a shell passed overhead, slicing the air like thunder. They escaped by inches. When they finally regrouped a kilometer back, only 3 of 12 panzers remained intact. The rest burned in the distance, black columns of smoke marking the field where arrogance had died. That night, the surviving crews sat around their machines, faces lit by the glow of fires still burning on the horizon. No one spoke for a long time. The air was heavy, still humming with the echo of battle. Finally, one gunner muttered, "We said they were farmers. Farmers don't build that." Reinhardt wrote in his logbook, "Their new tank defies everything we know. Fast. Thick armor. Powerful gun. Our shells bounce off like pebbles. If this is standard issue, we're in trouble." He tore the page out and slipped it into his jacket. He didn't want headquarters to call it panic. But deep down, he knew the war had just changed. The next morning, the sun rose through a haze of ash. Scavengers picked through the wreckage, silent but for the crackle of cooling steel. One panzer lay on its side, hatch open, its paint scorched to gray. On the edge of the field, a T-34 sat motionless, its crew dead, but the machine itself looked almost untouched, like a statue of victory left behind. Reinhardt stared at it before moving on. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them leave. Later, in a field report, he wrote only one sentence. "We have seen the future of armored war, and it is not ours." The confidence that had carried them from Poland was gone. Ahead lay Smolensk, and something waiting in the smoke. July 6, 1941, near Lepel, Belarus. After the last Soviet barrage guttered out, the field went quiet as if the smoke itself held its breath. Crows hopped along furrows, wheat lay combed flat by shock waves. Men of the German All 7th Panzer stood beside their vehicles in the grey light, tasting cordite and dust. The order crackled, "Advance," and engines answered. Tracks bit, hulls shivered, the rhythm of advance resumed. They expected wrecks and stragglers. Instead, the horizon thickened. A sound rose from inside the haze, not the light chatter of the BTs they had cut to pieces, but a deeper note, like a millstone under water. The first silhouette resolved where the smoke thinned, low, long, its front plate slanting like a wedge. Someone said, "Check." Another, "Captured French." The gunner in Lieutenant Heinemann's Panzer III whispered what none wanted, "Unknown." 800 meters. Fire. The 37mm barked. A spark jumped from the stranger's glacis and died. Second shot, another shrug of light. Then the unknown tank's turret turned, slow, inevitable. Its first round took the Panzer on their left in the ring, the turret lifted like a hat, then fell wrong side up. The shockwave arrived a beat late, a slap across the teeth. Radio discipline cracked. Voices overlapped, not penetrating. Angle. He's still coming. The shape accelerated, Grousers throwing clods as it cut diagonally with economy. Heinemann ordered armor piercing at point blank. The third shot went in at 200 meters, pinged, skipped, vanished. A fourth Soviet vehicle emerged behind the first, then a fifth, gray-green skinned slick. A column, not a miracle. A panzer tried to flank. The new tank swiveled, rammed nose to nose, and simply pushed, steel screaming. The German machine slewed, climbed, and toppled into a drainage ditch. Through binoculars, a staff officer watched a shell crater bloom in the stranger's track path and thought he saw the links flex around the hole as if the machine had learned to walk. He wrote later in a pocket notebook, "Our guns bounce like peas. Armor sloped, rounds deflect upward. Mobility astonishing." Another hand scrawled in grease pencil across a periscope, "Got Hilf UNS." They tried everything they had been taught. Smoke to blind. Crossfire to divide attention. Short rushes between hedges. The enemy answered with method, not fury, two halting to cover while the rest advanced in pairs, guns rocking back in recoil, hatches shut. Line by line the position unwound. A radio car behind the line sent one last clean sentence before a shard took its antenna. New Soviet type believe T-34, repeat, T-34, recommend 50 mm. In the pause that followed, the field itself seemed to lean toward the advancing wedge. The lead T-34 climbed the road crown and, for a second, filled every optic with that slanted face, no rivets, only purpose. Heinemann's driver found reverse and lived. Others did not. When the smoke shifted, 3 German tanks burned, a 4th lay on its side like a dropped toy, and a 5th, still whole, idled with its crew gone, doors open, footprints leading away. The Soviets did not chase. They rolled past, headed west, engines drilling the air into a single, heavy chord. That evening a courier delivered a typed summary to regimental HQ, someone underlined a new noun 3 times, T-34. In the margin, if many, change everything. Night drew down. Far off, the same deep engine note returned and faded. The war that had promised to be a straight road was buckling into curves. At first light the next push would begin. Command would say the enemy had been an exception, a trick, a hole patched. But the crews who had watched their shells spark and die knew better. They had seen the future come out of the smoke, and it had not asked permission. August 1941, fields near Smolensk. The air shimmered with heat. Over the wide, broken fields, the smell of oil and charred metal lingered heavier than the smoke. Somewhere beyond the blackened tree line, engines groaned, deep, uneven, mechanical heartbeats that made the ground itself vibrate. Inside a Panzer III, the crew was sweating in silence. The armor turned the midday sun into an oven. The gunner wiped his forehead, squinting through the gunsight. Target ahead, he said flatly. Range 500. Lieutenant Otto Reinhardt, pale and dust-covered, gave the order without looking up. Fire. The cannon barked. The shell crossed the field, struck the Soviet tank in the chest, and bounced. Sparks scattered across gray armor like rain on stone. The ricochet sang off into the haze, and for a long moment, no one breathed. Reload, Reinhardt said. His voice cracked. The second round hit closer. Again, nothing. The enemy's sloped plate caught the shell and threw it aside. It was like firing pebbles at a fortress. The Soviet tank didn't stop. It came forward, grinding over the bodies of burned Panzer IIIs, turret turning slowly. Its gun shifted, and fired. The impact rocked the earth. A German tank 50 meters away vanished in a burst of flame. The radist, pale and shaking, grabbed his headset. We can't penetrate. They're coming straight at us. We can't, his voice drowned in static as another blast threw dust through the turret slits. Outside, the field was a vision of chaos, wrecks burning, ammunition cooking off with dry pops, black columns rising into a perfect blue sky. German shells ricocheted harmlessly from the advancing machines, while Soviet rounds found their marks with horrifying precision. The air itself trembled with the thunder of engines and gunfire. Reverse. Reinhardt shouted. The driver ground the gears, but the tank barely moved in the churned mud. They fired again, a last attempt, and watched the shell skid off the T-34's front like a skipping stone on water. It kept coming. 50 meters. 40. The Soviet gun flared again. Reinhardt ducked as shrapnel shredded the periscope glass. Out, he screamed. The hatch flew open. Heat slammed into them like a wall. The crew scrambled into the open, coughing, stumbling across scorched soil. Behind them, their own Panzer erupted, the turret spinning off in a plume of fire. From a ditch, Reinhardt looked back. The T-34 rolled past the flaming wreck, black smoke curling against its hull. Through the waves of heat, it looked less like a machine and more like a creature, silent, unstoppable, covered in dust and sunlight. Across the field, another German platoon was firing everything they had, 37 mm, 50 mm, even 88 mm flak guns dragged down from the rear. Some shells dented, some cracked the armor's edges, but none stopped it. The Soviet tanks kept advancing until they ran out of fuel or targets. In his diary that night, Oberleutnant Heinz Guderian wrote, "Our weapons prove useless. Even the 50 mm cannot breach the armor. Our tanks are impotent. Infantry in panic. For the first time, we have felt fear before Russian machines. Fear, not of men, but of metal." In the following days, entire sections of the front collapsed not because of Soviet numbers but because of this new shock. Commanders who had once joked about primitive equipment now begged for heavier guns. The Pak-36, once proud symbol of German precision, earned a new, bitter nickname, Heersangklopfgerät, the army's door knocker. Soldiers laughed when they said it, but the laughter was brittle. Even artillery seemed to falter. Anti-tank batteries fired until barrels glowed red, until the ground under them turned to glass. And still, the gray silhouettes moved through the smoke, impervious, terrible, beautiful in their simplicity. Reinhardt's unit retreated beyond Smolensk. In his last report before radio contact failed, he wrote, "We are outgunned. Our shells bounce like stones. They advance as if immortal." Behind his words lay a truth the High Command refused to print: the myth of German invincibility had cracked. Days later, when the smoke finally lifted, Soviet wrecks littered the fields too, dozens of them, proof that bravery alone couldn't change the tide. But among the ruins, soldiers noticed something strange: many T-34s had stopped not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks. Their armor was intact. The Germans studied the holes where shells had struck and simply fallen away. It wasn't the victory they had wanted. It was a revelation, that war had shifted into something they didn't yet understand. At dusk, Reinhardt climbed onto the charred remains of his tank. The metal was still warm. In the distance, another T-34 burned, its outline glowing against the horizon. The night wind hissed through its shattered barrel. He stared until the last light died. "They told us we were the hunters," he whispered. "Now we are the prey." And across the vast, smoky plain, the echo of engines answered, fading, but not gone. October 1941, Orel-Mtsensk. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on a world of mud. Every road was a river of clay, every village a ruin soaked in smoke. The 4th Panzer Division crawled east toward Mtsensk, engines growling, exhaust curling like steam from wounded beasts. Reports promised only scattered Soviet rearguards ahead. The men believed it. They had learned to. By morning, the fog thickened until the horizon vanished. A few scouts moved forward and returned pale, saying only, "Too quiet." The line advanced anyway, tanks nose to tail, infantry clinging to the sides, boots slurping in the mire. Confidence, that old companion, followed close behind. Then, at 9:27, the first explosion tore it apart. A shell dropped from the treeline and turned the lead panzer into a pillar of fire. Seconds later, 2 more impacts struck the convoy's heart. Flames burst across the highway, engines screamed, drowning out the radios. "Flank attack," someone yelled. But there was no flank, only forest, fog, and something invisible moving within it. Colonel Mikhail Katakov's tank brigade had waited through the night in ambush, hulls half buried, camouflage woven from branches and earth. When the German spearhead entered the narrow valley, the Soviets struck from 3 sides. From the west came the low rumble of T-34s breaking cover, their guns already trained. Inside his Panzer III, Lieutenant Otto Reinhardt heard the thunder before he saw it. "Contact front," the gunner shouted. The fog split, and there it was, broad, slanted armor catching the dim light like wet stone. "Range 300. Reinhardt ordered. The 50 mm cannon fired. The shell bounced high, trailing sparks. Another round. Another ricochet. The Soviet tank didn't slow. Its turret swung, precise as a clock hand. The return shot hit the Panzer ahead of them square in the hull. The explosion folded the vehicle in half, throwing burning fragments into the ditch. Reinhardt's crew froze. "Smoke," he barked, and they obeyed, reversing blind through the haze. But the smoke worked against them. Shapes moved within it, 3, 4, maybe more, like wolves in a snowstorm. Muzzle flashes bloomed, brief and white, then vanished again. All across the front, Katakov's tanks struck with terrifying precision. They didn't fight in lines like the Germans expected. They circled, split, attacked from angles, fired and disappeared. German anti-tank guns tried to deploy but sank in the mud. Crews shouted range numbers into the wind, their shells clanged harmlessly off Soviet armor. General Erhard Raus, commanding the division, later wrote, "We were attacked by something we could not understand. They came from nowhere, struck fast, and melted away. These were not the untrained men our propaganda had promised. They were professionals." By noon, the battlefield had turned into a graveyard of German steel. Trucks burned with a steady, almost peaceful flame. The road was choked with wrecks and abandoned guns. Somewhere behind the lines, a captured T-34 rolled silently across the mud, driven by German engineers who wanted to see what it could do. When it reached a hill and climbed without effort, they stared in disbelief. Reinhardt's tank limped back toward the rear. Mud clung to the tracks, smoke filled the turret, and his crew sat in silence. They had seen panzers die before, but not like this. Not so easily. By nightfall, rain began again, fine and cold. The flames dimmed, replaced by the soft hiss of water on metal. In the glow of burning fuel, officers wrote hasty reports. Phrases repeated themselves, unexpected enemy tactics. Superior armor. Losses severe. One commander summed it up more plainly, "Blitzkrieg is no longer possible here." The next morning, a salvage team wrapped the captured T-34 in canvas and hitched it to 2 trucks. "Get it to the railhead," an engineer muttered. "Berlin needs to see this." He ran his hand along the armor, expecting rough seams or brittle welds. Instead, it was smooth, flawless. "Not primitive," he whispered. "Perfect." Back at the front, survivors gathered by burned vehicles. The silence was heavy, broken only by distant artillery. For the first time, they didn't talk about victory. They talked about luck, who had lived, who hadn't, and how something built in the East could outfight all the pride of German industry. Raus's final entry that night was brief. "Mtsensk. We met the T-34. Our confidence died here." In Berlin, officers argued about new weapons, new guns, new plans. But in the muddy fields of Orel, the men who had fought that day already knew the truth. The war had changed shape. They had entered Russia as hunters. Now they moved through it like men being hunted. And in every shattered panzer, on every scorched road, one name lingered like smoke, T-34. November 1941, behind the German lines. The snow came early that year. It didn't fall softly, it devoured sound, swallowing every echo of the front until even artillery seemed distant, like thunder beyond the mountains. In the captured city workshops near Smolensk, floodlights burned day and night over something the Germans had never seen before, a Soviet T-34. The tank sat on blocks, its armor stripped of mud, its sloped surfaces catching the pale light like a glacier. Around it moved engineers in grey coats from Daimler-Benz, Maybach, and Krupp, men who once spoke of German supremacy with practiced ease. Now they whispered, measuring angles, tapping with wrenches, muttering in disbelief. "This armor," one said quietly, "is not welded like ours, it's poured, seamless. Look at the slope. Every shot will glance off." Another leaned close to the engine bay. "And this? A diesel engine. Cooler, safer, cheaper than ours." "How did they?" He didn't finish the sentence. In a corner of the hangar, Major von Reimann, a liaison from Berlin's ordnance office, smoked his 6th cigarette since dawn. "Get me everything," he said. "Blueprints, weights, armor thickness, turret ring diameter. I want to know how peasants built this miracle." His tone was somewhere between awe and contempt. The men worked in silence, only the hiss of acetylene torches breaking it. Every discovery was another blow to pride. The T-34 wasn't a copy of anything, it was something entirely new. Simple enough for mass production, strong enough to terrify veterans, light enough to move through mud where German panzers drowned. It shouldn't have existed, and yet here it was, beautiful in its brutality. "Look at this suspension," one of the younger engineers said. "Christ, it's elegant. They've used wide tracks, see? That's why they don't sink in the mud." Ryman turned away. "Elegant? It's barbaric." But he said it softly. At a long table, an officer dictated a report. His voice echoed under the roof beams. "Our analysis indicates that current German tanks are technically inferior in armor slope, firepower, and mobility. Urgently recommend development of a counterweapon. That counterweapon would soon be given a name, Panther." In another workshop, they disassembled a second wrecked T-34 to study the gun. 76 mm, someone said. "Simple optics, crude machining, but it works. It always works." Everywhere, the same sentence appeared in field memos: "We underestimated them." Reinhardt, whose crew had survived Mtsensk, stood at the edge of the hangar. His hands were still raw from frostbite, but his eyes stayed fixed on the machine. The smell of cold oil filled the air, mixed with tobacco and defeat. "We used to think precision was everything," he said to a mechanic beside him. "Now I think maybe simplicity is stronger." The mechanic nodded but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Outside, wind howled through the broken factory windows, scattering snow across the floor like ash. Someone shut off the lights. In the sudden darkness, the T-34 loomed black against the pale drift, a silhouette of the war's new face. The next morning, the officers boarded a transport plane bound for Berlin. They carried drawings, fragments of armor, and a quiet humiliation that weighed more than steel. At the airfield, Ryman met with a colonel from the General Armaments Department. "So it's true," the colonel said after hearing the report. "The Russians have built the better machine." Ryman's jaw tightened. "For now." The colonel lit a cigarette. "You think we can catch up?" Ryman looked out over the frozen runway, where rows of damaged panzers waited for repair. "We can build something heavier," he said finally. "But we'll never build something simpler. And simplicity wins wars." Back in the hangar, the abandoned T-34 sat half covered in frost. A crow landed on its barrel, shook the snow from its wings, and flew off toward the east. In Berlin, engineers began drafting blueprints for the Panther, an elegant, complicated answer to a problem that no longer belonged to technology, but to time. For every T-34 rolling out of Soviet factories, the Germans would spend weeks hand-fitting bolts and polishing armor. The war's rhythm was changing, shifting toward whoever could build faster, not prettier. In December, Guderian's headquarters received a final field summary: "Enemy tank designated T-34 is superior to all current German models. Recommend immediate rearmament." The note ended with a single word underlined twice: urgent. But by the time it reached Berlin, snow had already sealed the roads. The T-34s were moving again, east to west, their engines echoing through the winter silence. Reinhardt heard them one night from his position near Tula, a faint mechanical hum beyond the wind. He thought of the tank in the hangar, its sloped armor catching the light, its engine whispering through the cold. He knew what it meant. They had started the war laughing. Now they were studying their enemy's machine like scripture. And somewhere, in the heart of that winter, the myth of German superiority died, quietly, under the sound of a Soviet engine. December 1941, outside Moscow. The cold came like a living thing. It didn't bite, it crushed. Metal froze until it sang when struck, and oil turned to paste inside engines. At -30 degrees, even breath felt heavy enough to fall to the ground. Across the endless white plain, the German army stood within sight of Moscow's outskirts, close enough to see the glow of the city's fires, but too weak to reach them. For months, they had driven east, certain the campaign would end before winter. Now their tanks stood silent, half buried in snow, their fuel thick as tar. Inside frozen panzer hulls, crews wrapped themselves in rags and waited for orders that never came. Radios crackled with fragments of despair, engines won't start, we need antifreeze, no movement possible. On the other side of the line, the Red Army prepared to strike back. The order for a counteroffensive came like a breath of warmth through the freezing dark. In the makeshift camps outside Moscow, men and women scraped frost from their T-34s, striking frozen bolts with hammers, warming their hands on exhaust pipes. Someone began to hum a song, low, steady, like the sound of diesel engines coming to life. A tank commander, Sergeant Ivan Gorokov, wrote in his diary that night. "We did not know what waited for us tomorrow. But we trusted the machine beneath us. It feels alive in the cold. When everything else stops, it still breathes." The morning of December 5, 1941, dawned in silence. Then came the cough of diesel engines, dozens, then hundreds. Across a front 200 kilometers long, Soviet armor rolled forward through the snow. The T-34s led the way. The Germans heard them before they saw them, a low growl building through the storm, echoing across the frozen fields. Commanders shouted, crews scrambled, trying to wake machines that refused to move. Frost cracked under boots as soldiers swung cranks and cursed the cold. But the panzers did not wake. Their engines, designed for mild European summers, seized in the Arctic air. The lubricants had turned to jelly. Even the machine guns froze solid. And through the blizzard, the T-34s kept coming. One German lieutenant, Kurt Heinemann, wrote later in his memoirs. "They came straight over the snow. No roads, no tracks. The drifts that stopped us meant nothing to them. We stood helpless as they advanced, slow, deliberate, inevitable. On the battlefield, the sound was unreal. No gunfire at first, just the grinding rhythm of steel treads chewing through ice. The tanks moved like creatures from the earth itself, their turrets rimmed with frost, red stars barely visible beneath the snow. When the first shells fired, they shattered the silence like glass. Soviet guns roared in unison, flame flashing against the blue-white world. German lines folded under the impact. Panzers burned where they stood, unable to retreat or fight back. Infantry scattered through snowdrifts waist-deep, chased by diesel smoke and thunder. Inside one advancing T-34, Gorokov's crew worked in near darkness, the periscope coated in ice. "Left. Fire," he shouted. The gun barked, a flash lit the turret for an instant. His loader, only 19, laughed as he jammed another shell into the breach. "She's not cold," he yelled over the roar. "She's alive." By noon, entire sections of the German front had cracked. Tanks once thought unstoppable now stood gutted, their blackened hulls half hidden under falling snow. Soviet troops advanced behind the armor, rifles slung low, scarves pulled to their eyes. The frozen air smelled of fuel and cordite. But what drove them was not revenge or ideology. It was survival, and the belief that, for the first time since June, the enemy could be beaten. The T-34 was more than a tank now. It was proof. From a nearby hill, a German observer watched the scene through binoculars until the lenses fogged. His notes, later found in a burned half-track, read only: "We are fighting the weather, the distance, and a machine that does not freeze." By dusk, the temperature dropped even further. The battlefield turned silent again, smoke rising slowly through the twilight. Among the wrecks, some T-34 crews climbed out to stretch their legs, faces red from frostbite and wind. Gorokov looked at the white expanse ahead and whispered, "So this is what victory sounds like, silence." That night, campfires flickered weakly in the snow. Engineers poured hot oil into their engines to keep them from dying. Somewhere behind the lines, a young soldier carved the words, "For Moscow," into the armor of his tank with a bayonet. For the Germans, December 1941 marked the end of the dream that had carried them from the plains of France to the gates of the Soviet capital. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had slowed, then stopped, buried under snow and steel. Even in the German diaries, the tone changed. No more boasts, no more laughter. Just exhaustion and disbelief. They do not stop, one wrote. Even the weather fights for them. Under the frozen moon, long columns of T-34s continued to move west, engines rumbling through the storm. Their tracks carved deep scars into the snow, scars that pointed only one way, toward Germany. And as the cold deepened, both armies understood the truth the hard way. The age of quick victories had ended. The war had become a test not of strength, but of endurance. Beneath the ice outside Moscow, Blitzkrieg died, and a different kind of war began. 1942, Berlin and the Eastern Front. In the heart of Berlin, the air smelled of oil, metal shavings, and quiet panic. The conference room of the Armaments Ministry was filled with smoke thick enough to touch. Blueprints littered the table, curved armor, sloped plates, new suspension systems. On one of them, scrawled in pencil, was a single word underlined twice, Panther. The Russians have changed the rules, said Colonel Muller, chief of the Tank Design Bureau. His voice trembled despite his rank. We can't keep sending men in panzers that die in 30 seconds. Across the table, a Daimler-Benz engineer removed his glasses. Then we'll make one better than theirs. Heavier, faster, thicker armor. A perfect machine. Silence. Then another voice, older, calm, tired. Perfect machines, he said, don't win dirty wars. But the Reich believed perfection could still save them. By spring, German engineers were sketching the first Panther prototypes, obsessed with outmatching the T-34. Every meeting circled back to the same idea: copy its sloped armor, double its firepower. Yet every improvement added weight, every adjustment added delay. The Panther was meant to be the answer. Instead, it became a mirror of Germany itself, ambitious, brilliant, and impossibly overdesigned. While Berlin drew blueprints, thousands of miles east, the Soviet Union was doing something simpler. It was moving. Entire factories, steel presses, engine plants, assembly lines, were dismantled, packed onto trains, and shipped east of the Urals. Men, women, and children worked in freezing sheds with broken windows, surrounded by the thunder of hammers. They slept beside machines to keep them from freezing, lived on bread crusts and tea, and built T-34s by the hundreds. In Kharkov, Gorky, Nizhny Tagil, the sound of welding became the heartbeat of survival. A Soviet engineer wrote in his notebook, "We build without paint, without polish. But when it rolls, it kills." The contrast was absolute. In Berlin, designers argued over millimeters of armor. In the Urals, workers used torches to cut through ice so the coolant wouldn't freeze. Each factory had a slogan painted in red above the gates: "Every tank means 1 kilometer closer to home." German intelligence reports from the front began using a new word: mass production. They couldn't believe the numbers. Soviet tanks were appearing faster than they could be destroyed. In a letter seized from a German officer near Kharkov, he wrote, "Their machines look crude. No radios. Bare metal. But there are too many. We destroy 10, and 20 come back. We repair 1 panzer, and lose 3 more to break down. They repair in hours what takes us days." By late summer, the first Panthers reached the testing grounds. They were magnificent to look at, sleek, angular, predatory. But when driven, gearboxes cracked. Engines overheated. Transmission fluid leaked across the concrete. "It's like taming a tiger," one test driver said. "Powerful, but it wants to kill you first." At the same time, a shipment of T-34s rolled out of the Ural plants. No ceremony, no paint, just numbers stenciled in white and red dust clinging to their hulls. The crews climbed aboard, lit cigarettes, and drove straight to the front. The German officers saw it differently. "They build them like hammers," one wrote in frustration. "We build ours like watches. And this war doesn't reward watches." Even as the Panther program grew, time itself turned traitor. The Eastern Front swallowed everything: fuel, men, hope. Logistics officers complained that every spare part was different, every tank unique. But in the Soviet Union, simplicity became strategy. Every T-34 part fit every other T-34. One machine dead meant another could live. Back in Berlin, propaganda films showed the sleek new Panther rolling majestically through snow. The narration promised that Germany had reclaimed its armored supremacy. But in the East, Panzer crews learned another truth: a tank that takes 2 weeks to repair isn't a weapon, it's a liability. A report from the 4th Panzer Regiment put it bluntly. The enemy sacrifices quality for quantity. We sacrifice time for precision. The result is that we die precisely. Winter returned again, and with it the grinding chorus of Soviet engines. The T-34s, blackened with soot, moved like a tide through the forests near Rzhev and Voronezh. Wherever the ground froze, they followed. A German major radioed back from the front. They move without supply, without rest, without fear. When our tanks stop for fuel, theirs keep going. When we dig in, they come through the snow. The Panther would go on to become one of the most formidable tanks of the war. But in 1942, it existed mostly on paper, an idea chasing a ghost. And that ghost was already multiplying, rolling west by the thousands. As one Soviet mechanic wrote on the side of a tank before it left the factory. Not beautiful. Not perfect. But alive. When that tank crossed the front weeks later, covered in mud and ice, its gun turned toward the west. The message painted on its hull was still visible beneath the frost. And for the men who saw it through binoculars, that single word explained the war better than any report or speech could: alive. 1943 to 1945, from Kursk to Berlin. The summer of 1943 began with thunder that had nothing to do with weather. Across the Russian steppe, the horizon flickered with muzzle flashes: the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history. The air smelled of dust, hot metal, and cordite. For weeks, both armies had prepared for this moment, the Germans with their new Panthers and Tigers, the Soviets with legions of T-34s dug into fields, waiting like predators in ambush. On the morning of July 5, a low hum rolled across the plains. It wasn't a storm. It was 3,000 tanks moving at once. German commanders believed their armor superiority would crush the Red Army in days. But they hadn't counted on numbers, or willpower. Captain Mikhail Biryakov, commanding a T-34 platoon near Prokhorovka, wrote afterward, "The ground trembled under us. When I looked through the periscope, all I saw was fire and dust. I couldn't tell where ours ended and theirs began." He led his unit straight into the melee. Panthers fired at long range, their 75mm guns ripping through the first line of T-34s. But the Soviet tanks didn't stop. They closed the distance, ramming, circling, firing from point blank. Inside their turrets, crews worked like parts of a machine: no hesitation, no pause. A German officer recorded in his log, "They came from every direction. We fired until the barrels glowed red. They kept coming. It was as if the land itself was against us." The battle raged for hours. When the dust finally cleared, fields once covered in wheat had turned to black mud and twisted steel. Hundreds of wrecks smoked side by side: Panthers, Tigers, T-34s, all indistinguishable under the soot. But the front had held. The German advance was over. That day marked a turning point not only in the war, but in memory. Kursk proved that the myth of invincibility had burned out. The T-34, once dismissed as crude, had broken the back of Blitzkrieg. In Berlin, the reports were grim: losses unacceptable. Production delays catastrophic. The Eastern War cannot be sustained. In Moscow, the tone was colder, simpler: they will not reach us again. By 1944, the Red Army no longer waited for attacks, it gave them. The T-34s led the way through Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic. Their silhouettes, low, angled, familiar, became a symbol not of desperation, but inevitability. A German soldier retreating near Warsaw wrote in his final letter home, "I can tell them by the sound now. That deep diesel growl. You hear it once, and you never forget it. It means it's time to run." For Soviet crews, life inside the T-34 was still brutal: heat, smoke, deafening noise, but the machine never betrayed them. They repaired it with hammers, welded armor in barns, replaced engines in hours. It was no longer just a tank. It was part of their blood. By early 1945, the Red Army stood on the Oder River. Berlin lay only a few days away. The snow was black with ash, the air heavy with smoke and silence. A veteran of the first battles near Smolensk, now grizzled and gray, leaned against his tank and said, "When I first saw this machine, I didn't think it would survive the war. Now I don't think the war would have survived without it." In April, the final assault began. The streets of Berlin shook under the tracks of hundreds of T-34s. Buildings collapsed as shells tore through them, fire mixed with the rain. Civilians hid in basements, listening to the thunder above, the same sound that had echoed in the fields of Russia 4 years earlier. For the Germans who remained, the irony was complete. One soldier who had been there since 1941 wrote in his diary, "When I first saw the T-34, I laughed. Today I watched them roll through our city, and I said nothing." As the red banner rose over the Reichstag, a single T-34 stood nearby, engine still idling. Its crew, young men who hadn't been alive when the war began, climbed out in silence. Snowflakes melted on the tank's warm armor, running down in streaks like tears. The war that began with arrogance ended with exhaustion. Factories fell silent. The fields that once burned with battle began to bloom again. But the image of that tank, muddy, scarred, unstoppable, remained burned into the memory of a generation. In the ruins of Berlin, a German officer captured by Soviet troops looked at a passing column of T-34s and said quietly, "We built ours to be perfect. You built yours to win." The Soviet interpreter didn't reply. He only watched as the tanks rolled west, their red stars glinting in the pale morning light. And somewhere in the distance, under the smoke and the rain, the sound of diesel engines faded into history, leaving behind not triumph, not glory, but a simple, eternal truth. They laughed when they first saw it. But the laughter drowned in the roar of war. Because out of that smoke, the T-34 emerged, and never disappeared again.